So today we're going to talk about learning a new development language. And this is with the idea that you're basing it on some foundational knowledge you already have, including, along with that foundational knowledge, an existing development language, at least one that you already know. And I mean, know like as in you can write some good applications in it and you're comfortable with it, or in a college sense that you've taken a class where that was the language that you worked on. So you've probably done at least, maybe you haven't done like a full-blown enterprise, CRM app or something huge like that, but you have built a complete application of some sort and probably multiple times. So it's not just, or multiple applications. So it's not just a passing knowledge, but hey, I can do some work in this knowledge, preferably with more than one language. But even with one, there's things that you know that will be able to apply here. The more languages you know, the easier it becomes to add new ones. And we won't get into it, but it does have a lot to do with how there's a lot of similarities between certain languages. There's like families of coding languages, just like there are spoken languages. So there are some languages that the more that you've learned, the more likely whatever new language you're going to try to learn has some shared attributes with something you already know. So when I say learning a language, what I mean is that when you're done, when you've gotten to the point where you've, quote, learned a language, in this case, for our purposes here, you're able to perform some maintenance tasks. So it's the kind of thing where if somebody gives you an application somebody's already worked on, and they say, well, this is roughly where it's broken, you can go in, you can figure it out, and you can sort of muddle your way through the code, which is probably the most entry-level way of having some experience with the language, where you can just sort of, know it enough that you can go in and you can putz around with it a little bit, and you can find a way to, do some maintenance stuff where there's a lot of examples there. The code roughly works. It's it's sort of a pinpoint break that you're trying to fix. But on top of that is that you can build an application from scratch. And by application, I don't mean necessarily a huge full-blown application, but I'm talking like the Hello World type application or something like that, where you can take some code, put together, whatever libraries or things it needs to do, compile it, or whatever needs to be done to prepare it to execute or run, and actually run the application. So that's that would be obviously a step in learning it. On top of that would be then accomplishing common tasks, things like, and we'll go into these a little bit more, but things like input and output of, user input and output to maybe like a screen or a file, loops and logical checks and some things like that. And then also, I think a key part to learning a language is recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of the language. Because I think if you don't understand that, you haven't spent enough time in it. And of course, this is also where this is important that you've got other languages that you've worked with, because those strengths and weaknesses you're going to want to be able to compare to. And maybe that's the only way you even know what the strengths and weaknesses are, is that you have another language to compare it to. For example, if I started with the C language and I'm pretty solid, maybe I got a year or two experience in C, and then I decide to move to Java and go learn that. Well, what I would, by the time I can say I've learned it, then I would not only be able to build a little Java application, maybe use a little Swing app or something like that, build an interface. I can take input, output, I can do some file IO and things like that. And also I can say, okay, for application X, it is a better suitable application to do in C for these reasons, or in Java for these reasons, depending on what the strengths and weaknesses are of those languages. For example, with Java and C, like an obvious one is that C is compiled, Java is not. So, if it's something where it's like, well, I need a executable that's only ever going to run on one machine, okay, maybe that works for C. If it's, I need an application, I need to write it and then be able to run it on, 5 different operating systems, okay, then C is probably not going to work for you. The Java is going to be, that's going to play to Java's strength. Now, the thing to remember when you start learning a new language is that you already know some stuff, and it's actually pretty important stuff, because you've built application before and because you've gone through that process essentially from front to back of building an application. one of the things is common programming constructs, processes and logic required for common tasks, and then the strengths and weaknesses of at least one or more languages. All of these apply back to the points of how to learn it. And by the common constructs and processes and logic, to make those a little more real, it's things like you understand the idea of data types, maybe like strings versus numbers or collections. You understand the idea of what a loop is. You understand of what calling a function is, things like that. These are things that are very important to learning a new language, because these are things you already know. You don't have to, like you did the first time you learned a language, you don't have to learn all of these programming language concepts. You already know them. So now it's does to some extent, although they may be approached differently, it tends to be a lot more of a syntax challenge or exercise more than anything. And so some common programming constructs to get, like I said, take that down another level. Some of the things, it would be like just working with variables in general, assigning X, the value 3 to X, and then being able to work with X. Loops, whether they're while loops or for, even like go-tos and things like that, where it's jumping around in the flow. And of course, logic and related structures, whether it's switch statements or cases or ifs or else's, and the expressions around those. So, if A is less than B and C is greater than D, or true, or whatever it is, how those things work, understanding that basic concept that appears right away almost in every language you're going to deal with. Data related stuff like containers and collections, and then of course with those being able to iterate across data, over data in collections. So having solved those kinds of problems before, as I mentioned, calling functions and the idea of calling a function and returning a value, and then even with calling a function, sending parameters into the function, and the idea of either those parameters are, can be modified and spit back out, or not, whether they're copies or by reference, some of those concepts that are key to just about any programming language. And of course, input and output, the idea of just, don't think about it because you've probably done it so many times, but the idea, the concept of a keystroke in processing it, or sending something out to a screen, or sending it out to a file. It's pretty much the same from language to language conceptually, but if you haven't known that, if you haven't done that before, then it can be a challenge. Some of the common tasks that you would run into would be like string processing, whether it's finding the leftmost character or the rightmost, or splitting it, things like that. Working with numbers, just basically math and calculations. So summing and averaging and some things like that you'll have done before. Processing input, so it's beyond just like, okay, they sent me a string, it's actually doing something with whatever that input is that they that you've been that you've received, that the application's received. The opposite of that is output, or sharing results, whether it's instantaneous to a screen display, or maybe it's putting it out to a file, or even some of the things like maybe it's sending out an email or working with the database, things like that can be, they're pretty common, but some of them are some advanced concepts that at least you've done it before. So you sort of, the solving the problem part of it you've done. The challenge again falls back to, okay, well, how do I do it in this environment with the way they flow and with their syntax? And of course, general user interaction, which is basically the input and output, but it's here I'm thinking more like flow and things like that. So it's more like event processing. And if you think of the UI world, where it's like you click on a button and it's like, okay, well, how do I, it's understanding the flow of an application, where it's not necessarily just a linear, like run an application and then it spits out some results. Some of the strengths and weaknesses that you may see in a given language, and some of the things that you would know if you've run into some of these, is whether they're good as general purpose languages, like your C's, your C++s, your Javas, your C Sharps, those kind of things that you can do pretty much anything in them. Versus like SQL, if you don't have a database, SQL becomes pretty much useless. And then if you want to have like a really nice interface and stuff like that, that's not where SQL's strong suit is, if at all. Data manipulation. So some of these things, there are some languages that are much better at dealing with data and moving it around and storing it and working with collections of it and things like that. Like a lot of your batch and script languages, they don't really do that very well. I mean, if you go to like an awk or a sed, there's some those kind of languages that do have that ability. But if you're talking like just like shell script or corn shell or DOS batch or some of those things, they're not really there. It's really tough if you're going to want to do like a big data manipulation type application with it. User experience. Obviously, if you've got a language that doesn't really provide for a user interface, then the user experience is not going to be terribly good. But there's other one like JavaScript that's pretty much it's built all on user experience, or actually you want to take it more CSS. Cascading style sheets and understanding that, that's all about the user experience. I guess you can put some logic in there, but you sure as heck not going to put some complex logic in style sheets. If you do, you're a masochist, basically. And then there's web versus desktop. Whether it's an application that runs on a desktop or runs in a browser. Obviously, there you're talking about like HTML, very good for web. If you want to get over to like X Windows or some of those kinds of things that allow you to do desktop applications. And then there's graphical libraries and things like that that may be not necessarily a language, but sit on top of one essentially. And then sort of getting out into stuff like whether you really want to approach it in a functional way or do object-oriented programming or batch programming or some of those other types of applications that are out there. Some are just much better than others at doing that. You can't really do functional applications in Smalltalk. You can't really do object-oriented programming in DOS batch. There's things like that there's some are going to be easier than others. So getting started, everybody starts with Hello World. And there's a reason for that. And it's good. It's recommended. I'd say do it all the time. Because what you get out of this, just doing your Hello World, when you think about it, is you've got the general application structure because you've put something together to actually run the application. And that's going to include any like requirements or includes or anything like that to be able to make a somewhat useful application that at least kicks out some sort of output. Some don't need anything. There are some that you're going to have like a string library or a screen library or something like that. And of course, with this is the compile or build or whatever is required to actually go from source code to an application. And of course, basic output. You've put the string hello world out to whatever the output is. And this happens to be also your simplest debugger. I mean, that's which of us have ever, have not been in a situation where we're coding and basically debug by, the equivalent in C of, debug with print lines or C outs or, those kinds of just, I'm going to kick something out to the screen or out to the console or out to a file. And of course, out the console being your absolute simplest debugger, just sort of print stuff as you go. And hey, at least you can, it may be slow and painful, but you can work your way through problems doing that. Once you're done with Hello World, we'll do what I'll call Hello World 2.0, which usually you'll see this if you're in a tutorial or some training kind of session is what ends up happening. Usually is you start with Hello World and then you start doing some stuff to that application or building on that basic concept. Usually one of the first things you'll do will be accepting input. And it's probably going to be like just a parameter that comes in when you launch the application. It may be something where it's like a keyboard input or something. So instead of Hello World, it's going to be something that says input your name and it'll say hello Dave, or something like that. So that's, yes, you're getting used to accepting input. Maybe with that, whether it may be keyboard input or it could be application parameters. So maybe it's, I'm going to, instead of always printing hello world, I'm going to run the application and give it a parameter. And that parameter is what it's going to print to the screen. It's basically going to just, basically it's an echo application at that point. Usually then some points you can get to logic operations. So sometimes you'll get like a hello world that becomes, it's sort of being advanced. So now it's like, hello, whatever your name is. So hello, Dave. And then maybe there's a logical thing that says, if the time is before noon, then say, print out good morning. If it's after 6 p.m., say good evening. Or if it's between those two, say good afternoon. Some things like that. So you can get used to some basic logic operations. And then, of course, then you can get into like some loops and flow, which is the idea that maybe it like says hello world and counts it out, 5 different times, or, things like that. These are all, if you're in a tutorial, you'll usually find this. If you're trying to figure it out yourself, these are great ways to start. I mean, there's a reason that you see these approaches so often, because it works. It gets you quickly into some meat of being able to work in that application. Once you get past the Hello World 2.0 and you've done some of those basic things, now it's time to start like really learning the application. So usually, and these things are going to vary a little bit on how you're going to want to attempt them. But typically, one of the things you want to do that you can learn fairly quickly is go to complicated parameters. So instead of, hello, Dave, maybe it's now I'm going to be able to pass it up to 3 different names and being able to figure out, hello, Dave and Mike and Timothy. And then also getting into the various types. So maybe there is something that's different between whether I send it the number 1 or the word 1 or a comma separated list of values, some things like that. Next step, it just seems like it's invariably something you're going to run into fairly quickly is going to be file I/O, whether you're trying to read in a list of parameters or whether you're reading in like initialization or preferences, and then output as well, whether you're just logging is pretty common, but there may also be some stuff where maybe you're writing out, you're building reports or things like that. Data storage and containers, it's hard to imagine applications that are terribly useful that don't deal with data and large amounts of it. So obviously, since you're dealing with it, you got to have a way to store it and transfer it and group it. So getting into those kinds of steps, getting into things where now, okay, I'm going to get something a little more complicated. I'm going to wheel these constructs around. So maybe it's now instead of a name, it's a name plus an address plus a phone number. And I'm going to bundle all those together and be able to, every time they tell me to, I can just print it out to a screen or write it out to a file or something like that. With all of this, and this one tends to be mixed in a little bit more, is interacting with the system or other applications. So it may be things like launching another application. It may be outputting stuff in a way that another file can pick, another application can pick it up. It may be grabbing information, like maybe from an API or something like that. So it's expanding the reach of your application outside of just itself. Probably sooner rather than later would be debugging. I think if you are not comfortable debugging in a language, you have not learned it. You're also a fool, because it's like if you're going to spend any real time with a language, you need to get comfortable with debugging in it. That is, and every place I've been for the last many, many years now, if I have to come into a new environment, that is and we've talked about this before too. That's one of the first things I want to do. I want to be able to know where the source code is. I want to know how to build it, and I want to be able to basically build it, run it, and debug it so that I can go in and get my environment set up so I can do those things, because those are going to affect you no matter how much code you're doing. Those are always going to be things you're going to need to do essentially. And then logging and exception handling. Logging sometimes comes in sooner rather than later because of the file I/O, and you can sometimes use that instead of setting up a good debugger. It's sort of like a quick and poor man's debugger. Exception handling, some languages don't allow it. Most of them have some level of it now, and understanding how that works and being able to, you're getting into now like really understanding an application or a language when you're able to detect and maybe even recover from errors and exceptions, because they're always going to exist. You're always going to, doesn't matter what the language is, there's always ways for exceptions to occur. Now we've got this language or languages that we already know. So let's talk about leveraging some of that knowledge. Well, one of the biggest things is that there's going to be syntactic similarities. So you can sort of guess your way through solutions. So if you've got, like Pascal had read line and write line, and I think Delphi now, basically carried those along. So you've got a read line and a write line, and then you've got C that had out. You could do like a system out, and then you've got print lines in Java. So if you jump into a new language and you're trying to figure out how to write something out to the console, you can sort of guess your way. You can look at those kinds of ways that it's been done in other languages and maybe Google it or try to, sort of scan for that in a technical reference or something like that. Or, maybe if you're in a Unix something, you may even be able to do just like a man page on that for that kind of command. So you don't necessarily have to have like a full blown reference there without, because especially with some, if you get good error messages out of like a compiler or runtime errors, things like that, you may be able to guess your way into how some of the syntax works. And then especially since it tends to be, it's hard to figure out how to say it, but there tends to be like a flow to syntax. So for example, if you have read lines and write lines, then you're probably going to have like a read and a write. If you got a print line, then you're probably going to have like just a print where, some do a line and then some just do a character or things like that. So once you get into a way to do a couple of these things, then the other is going to feel a little more familiar and it's going to be a little easier to guess your way through it if you need to. So you can almost pseudocode your way into, some of these things and then allow the compilers and things like that to help you correct. Or Google searches always help a lot too. Learning from your compile errors and warnings I don't know how often it's been where for me, and I've done this with some other people, we're like sitting there and I spend an hour trying to fix some problem and I'm yelling and screaming at the thing. And when I finally figure it out and I look at the compile error or the warning or whatever it is that started the whole thing, it tells me exactly what I needed to do. But for some reason, I just didn't read it right or guessed wrong or whatever and got completely off the rails. And I get all the way done and it's like, this stupid thing knew from the start what I needed to do. So take advantage of that early on. I think it's easier when you aren't comfortable with the language because you're going to read it a little more closely versus you get comfortable with the language or the application you're building. And I think you sort of get that, you get a little bit of a blindness there because you're like, yeah. And I don't think that's it. But then you find out that, no, that actually is it. So, take advantage of that kind of stuff wherever you can. Figure out where those errors and warnings and messages all get displayed, the log files or whatever they are, and check them out when you're having any kinds of problems. They will help you understand the language as well as solve whatever the specific bug is that you've been hit, you've run into. Differences across versions is that this is that depending on how long you've been in the language or two, you've probably at least seen multiple iterations of versions of that language. So you at least have some concept of how languages tend to evolve and how things work. And so you'll be able to understand that with the given language you're in. You may have, and this is really important in the world of Google because you may go search for something and you're sitting there looking at your code and you're looking at the code that Google's pointed you to, and you're sitting there saying, okay, this should work. Well, that's one of the things you may have run into is now you're like, oh yeah, what version is this? Oh, Google's showing me version 2, but I'm on version 3. Oh, so maybe I've got to do some more searches around that. So, it's things like that will hopefully help you leveraging that experience and solving those problems and how things sort of evolve may help you guess your way into stuff and speed your way into learning and becoming comfortable. And that includes back to the syntactic similarities where there's things where you may say, well, this thing used to only take one parameter. What if it takes a second one now? Because this seems like a parameter it would be likely to take, things like that. And again, as we get into the last bullet point, Google searches are awesome for this stuff. Once you've gotten comfortable in a language, then there's two things that you can do. Is one, where you can do a Google search that's basically how do I address this problem in this language? So it'd be like, how do I output to a file in Ruby? if you go Google that, you're going to get a whole bunch of good examples back, and boom, you're off and running. Another one that's very useful you'll find is that how do I do, like for example, let's say Java's iterators. So maybe it would be, how do I do a Java iterator in Ruby? And there's going to be things like that you'll be able to. You may have to may have to wordsmith those a little bit, but a lot of times those will come up. And for example, one that I've run into a lot was Swift had a very big change from earlier versions to later versions. So there's a lot of times where I would actually do a Google search. It was basically, whatever the command was in Swift 3 implemented in Swift 4. And then I would get a whole bunch of stuff on that and how to do it and to see how it had evolved. And depending on how common and popular language is, a lot of times you're going to actually get direct links into reference materials and documentation that allow you to really nail that thing right away. As part of learning, you can't just do it all on your own, I don't think. You can try, but what's going to end up happening is you're going to be missing some things. And so whether it's just you or you're on a team or however you're learning this language, make sure you spend a little time researching best practices. Go out there, and whether it's, and that's really these other items here sort of lead to that. It's things like look at people who have done this for a while and take a look at some of the code they've written and how they've approached a lot of these problems, because you may see that there's certain constructs or shortcuts or strengths or weaknesses of the language that get highlighted basically when you see how other people have solved problems. Build a fully functional and useful application. You can't really learn it if you've just been maintaining code. At some point, if you're going to sort of like check that on your box, say, hey, I've learned it, you need to have actually built out an application of some sort. It doesn't have to be huge. It can be like a simple recipe application or something like that, but you need to have done something where you've sort of walked through all of a group of functionality to be able to build an application. So you've done things like, the core stuff to get the application started, and how to get some input and how to do some output and how to process some data within it and how to store it and how to think about it in a way that is creating maintainable code and not just a bunch of spaghetti stuff that you spewed out in a file somewhere that if anybody sees it, they turn to stone. And I know everybody hates it, but don't be afraid to read some of the documentation. Find some tutorials. I don't care what the language is. There are tutorials out there. They're probably free, and there's probably some pretty decent ones. I mean, it's hard not to find them these days. There's just so much content out there, whether it's on YouTube or whether it's blog sites or whatever it is. Go out there and just sort of see how others have done this stuff. You can probably find stuff usually that are like the people that created the language or own language or are the key drivers of the language, that you can get some great information from them on how to use it. And finally, practice does make perfect. So if you want to learn a new language, even if it's in your day job, it's going to be easy. But if it's not, find an excuse at least a couple hours a week to work with it. And it's maybe just like you have to spend, Saturday afternoon, or hey, if you got nothing better to do, Saturday night or Sunday afternoon or whatever it is, spend a few hours building a little application with it. Or maybe it's something where it's a useful enough utility type language that you can, find a few jobs you can do during the week, then during your day job, that you can work on mastering that language. But it's one of the things, because otherwise it's just too easy to forget stuff, and then you essentially take a step backward. So if you can keep using it and keep it fresh in your mind enough, then you'll be able to keep progressing. Look for areas to utilize the strengths of it. This is really more getting into using it in your day job. Is if it does something really well, yes, your boss may hate you for introducing a new technology, but it may be a great way to do like a little one-off application or something like that. So keep an eye out for that stuff. Don't be afraid to, which is easy to do now, is there's so many blog sites out there and podcasts and things like that generate content that are not just the technical of doing these things, but they will talk about like architecting solutions and what are the strengths and the weaknesses and what are the best practices, and a lot of this stuff that all of them will help you be a better developer in that language. And of course, tutorials and classes, again, Um, there's the free ones and that kind of stuff that's out there, but maybe, maybe at some point it is worth it to spend a few bucks, or get your company to foot the bill to spend a few bucks to do a full tutorial, not like just a little 1 hour thing, but really something that accumulates to more of like a class, or an actual class where you go in and you sit there for maybe some days, or maybe even a couple of weeks, depending on how it's done, and really immerse yourself in that language and in that technology. And let me make sure I got this in order right. Yeah, okay. So some sort of wrapping this up a little bit. Language, it is, when you're early on in your career, it is very easy to be impressed with somebody that knows more languages than you do, whether it's 5 or 6, or, oh my gosh, they know 10 languages, or they know 20 languages, or something like that. Each language you learn becomes easier and easier and easier. And the way the world is today, is the way the modern environment is, and the development in the software world, I think you would be very hard pressed to spend 5 to 7 years developing and not have at least 5 to 7 languages that you have some knowledge of. I mean, you think about it, like off the top of your head, you probably know some CSS, some HTML, some JavaScript. You probably know like a C or a C++, like a Java or a C#. You probably know some SQL. That's half dozen languages right there. And that's not including like script languages, and in some senses you can almost say like some of the markups like XML, things like that. It becomes easier. So don't be afraid of it. If there's something where you have an opportunity and it's going to require you to learn a new language, then hey, feel free to jump in and learn the new language. I don't think it's not going to be as scary as it may seem, and it's always a nice thing to have on your resume, and it may be a great stepping stone to something else moving on. And then, of course, maintaining and editing existing code is often the easiest step. I mentioned this early on. This is a great way to just get some exposure to a language, and then maybe eventually you can sort of work your way into building out full-blown applications. Is that you start out and you just say, well, okay, if I just got to come in and do a little bit of bug fixes here or there, then you can probably do some simple bug fixes early on, where it's like, a line of code here, a line of code there, maybe a little bit of a logic error or something like that, and then move your way up to the maintenance work being stuff where maybe you're like writing all new functions, or rewriting functions, or maybe writing some code modules or things like that. And then eventually you can sort of work your way up to full-blown being very comfortable with that language. All right, then. I guess I'll open it now to questions, suggestions, thoughts.
I know you talked about it, but is there, like, when you're learning a new language, whereby you say, you know what, once I learn, let me say, these loops, then pretty much I'm done. This language, pretty much I've figured it out. The rest maybe is the same as what I already know. Or, I mean, is there, like, for instance, if you're learning a new language, is there like, okay, if I master this topic, like, then I'm done with the language, then the rest will be easy for me?
That's a good and a bit of a, although unintentional, I think a bit of a trick question. I think you can master a language. You can be very comfortable in language so that you get to a point where you basically can say, if somebody throws a problem at me, I can use this language to solve that problem. But there's always going to be, I think there's always going to be things you can learn as well, because there's going to be maybe some commands that you've never run into before. Languages evolve, and there's new libraries or add-ons or extensions or whatever you want to call them that get, that sort of make a language become more complex. And of course, they have new versions of it. So, you may know version 1 of a language, and then version 2 comes out. And depending on what the language is and the changes that they make, it could be that you've mastered version 1 and you are absolutely useless doing version 2 because of the changes that they made. And it may be that because you mastered version 1, version 2 is almost no different to you. So I think there's a mastery, but I like to think of it as when you master it, it's like an 80-20 rule where you're like 80% there. I don't think you can ever get to 100% with a language unless it's like really new and it's only for a short window of time, versus something that you've just been around that language for a long time. You can do pretty much every task, and you're really comfortable looking up, if there's anything new or an extension or anything like that you're essentially up to date with it. So you understand the best practices and the way to utilize that language.
Okay.
Another thing that helps with learning new languages is finding out what tools you can use. For instance, like you can use Eclipse for Java, PHP, things like that, or if you need to or want to learn .NET or C, C#, picking up Visual Studios is a good place to start too.
Yeah, Visual Studio, the big languages, which I'm thinking like C# or Visual Studio and the stuff that it provides, or Java, and although really the Java tutorial has always been really awesome and really useful. But IBM has got a lot of really good stuff on that as well. When you go to some of those big languages, the things that are just like built into some of the environments and the downloading of the software and some things like that that's very good things to take advantage of, because they can really help you get started quickly and help you through. And the things that I listed out early on, usually you'll find all of those. You'll find some really good, solid examples of those with some pretty decent explanations as well, as part of those getting started.
And another one would be look for kitchen sink examples for some languages. So like when I was learning to do mobile development, I would find a lot of like iOS kitchen sink apps already on GitHub for like Titanium. So let's see, Appcelerator had one, iOS had one, and what they are is it's kind of basically a cookie cutter application with everything you can do with the application or with the language. So you can do like maps, you could do geosynchronous locations, shopping carts, kind of how like to click a button, what goes behind that, actions, things of that nature too.
Yeah, they've got various names, but the all-in-one or super mega example applications and things like that. The kitchen sink one those kinds of things are great because it gives you everything. You can get there to one place, you can see the source, and you're not going to see like best practices necessarily, but you're going to see how to do a lot of different things with that, with that language and with that environment. And it is a great way to sort of jumpstart your knowledge very quickly, and those are especially useful when you're past your first or second language, because then you're going to be much better at being able to figure out exactly what that thing is, where the code is that generates that thing, and then be able to reproduce it yourself.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Thank you.
Yep. Other questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions, jokes, whatever? All right, then. Well, I guess that was not as thought-provoking as I expected. So, wrapping it up. So what do we learn through all of this? Look, once you've got a language or two under your belt, you got the foundational knowledge. It's basically just learning syntax, maybe a little bit of structure, but it's really not that hard. And the syntax, with spoken languages, it can be different because you may have to learn how to roll your tongue, or there may be sounds that you just really can't. You don't know how to do them because you just don't have that experience. But with programming language, it's really syntax, so it's not like you have to you have to learn how to like type it differently or anything like that. You just have to learn how to spell differently basically for it. And maybe it's a little bit of understanding parameters. You're going to get, the way to get better is obvious, really. It's just steadily in more complex applications. The more that you build on what you know, the further you're going to get towards mastery of that language. And as soon as possible, master the core tools. Get a good understanding of how debugging works in that environment. Compiling and building, deploying, the things that you're going to do a lot. Make sure that you're really comfortable with those, that you master those. The first thing you master should be those kinds of things, because they're going to help you be more productive as you're working within that language. And so that brings us to the end. As always, appreciate your time and hanging out and your questions and comments. Catch us wherever books like these are sold, or whatever it is. Basically, you can catch us at email at info@developernerd.com. Hit us at our website at https://developernerd.com. We've got a contact page, or just go to the homepage and you can find a whole bunch of stuff like this. You can also catch us out on Vimeo if you look for Developer out there. We've got a whole bunch of these kinds of things out there. I think we're up to about 40 or 50 videos now. At Developer on Twitter, facebook.com/developer, smoke signals, you name it, we'll figure it out. As always, hey, we're just trying to make every developer better, including ourselves. So any feedback you give us is greatly appreciated.